test containers, and Spring. Let's go. So I am working on a project, and in this project I am using Java 17, Maven, Spring, and Postgres SQL as my data source. And on that note, today I'm going to show you how to implement integration tests using test containers. Let's start over at the home page for an introduction. So what is test containers? Test containers is an open source framework that launches the target service within a Docker container, and then it will run the tests and eventually destroy the container. You do not need to worry about anything. That's the nice thing about test containers. And the framework literally does most of the work. The main thing to make sure of is that you have Docker installed in the form of Rancher Desktop or Docker Desktop, and the framework supports dozens of databases and modules. If you do not find the one that you need, you can always use the generic Docker creation API for test containers. And yes, even though I'm using Java in this case, you will see that test container supports or works with a lot of programming languages out there. And as mentioned, test containers does support a lot of modules. In this case, we will be looking at modules for databases. In this case, Postgres SQL, but as you can see, there are many more supported. And that's it on test containers introduction. Open your favorite IDE. I'm going to use IntelliJ, and let's get started. And here we are. I've got the POM file opened, and that's where we're going to start. So the first thing to highlight is that we're going to be using test containers 1.19.8. Now, because I know that I'll be bringing in more than one dependencies from test containers, I'm going to import the POM file right here. And then what I'm going to do is just reference that test containers version. You also want to make sure that you import as you go. Happiness so far. So now the first thing in the dependency section that we want to do is bring in the core framework, which is our Spring Boot test containers. This dependency facilitates and integrates between Spring Boot and test containers. It simplifies things like configuration and lifecycle management of test containers in a Spring Boot environment. So in this case, things like your JDBC or data source, password and username, and the JDBC URL will be taken care of by this dependency. Good. Now that we have that in place, we are going to jump to the actual test containers dependencies. We are going to be pulling these from the POM that we've actually imported earlier. So the first one we're going to look at is bringing in the JUnit Jupyter test containers dependency. Now this one integrates test containers with JUnit 5, aka the JUnit Jupyter. It provides the necessary classes and annotations to use test containers within JUnit 5 tests. And because we've already brought in the POM, I'm going to get rid of that version. And that is because the POM file we've imported is actually specifying the version. Okay, now let's look at the last piece, which is another dependency, again from the same POM file that we've imported. This is the Postgres test containers dependency. Now, this dependency provides a pre-configured Postgres SQL container that can be used within the integration tests. It allows you to run a Postgres container database inside a Docker container for testing purposes. And that's it. And once again, in this case, you want to get rid of the version because our test containers POM file is sorting that out for us. Great stuff. And that's it. Now remember to refresh your Maven POM just so that it refreshes and downloads these dependencies onto your project. Now we're ready to start coding. Okay, so to start coding, I've got a empty class here, which we'll be using for our test case. And don't worry, it's just implementing a base repo because I needed to get rid of a few beans from being active in this test case. So no worries there. We are going to be focusing on this class right here. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is use the test containers annotation, and you'll see in a minute why. And then the most important thing here is we're going to need to declare a static PostgreSQL container using the test containers dependencies, specifically the Postgres dependency that we brought in. Okay, and in the same breath, we might as well just initialize it right here. And in my case, I'm going to use a specific version because this is the version I'm using for my project. And remember, we want to get as close as possible to what will be running in production. So in this case, I'm using Postgres 16, and I'm going to pull in the Alpine version because it's smaller. I don't need anything huge for my test cases. And yeah, that's the whole idea. The next thing you want to do is tell JUnit that this is a container, again using the test containers framework. And we are going to get into the Spring annotation where we tell it to initiate a connection to this service. Remember, Postgres is actually a service. Let me just shorten this name here. And now, for the purpose of this presentation, I've just created a new line so that you're able to see. And the first important thing that you want to make sure is that your container is running. And we're going to make sure of that by using this test case here, which just checks if Postgres is created and also if Postgres is running. This is way before we jump into the nitty-gritties of testing our data access. Let me just drag this up here. And yay, we can see our actual Alpine container, which contains PostgreSQL Server was started. We can see Docker doing its thing there and its happiness. Okay, so we are happy with our test case so far. What we want to do is go through our repository because you haven't seen it. So it's just a quick skim through the repository and the entity that it's working for, and then we can jump into our test case. So here's our repository. It's got basic functionalities. Those who know Spring Data JPA understand this very well. It's part of the convention over configuration paradigm. And then what we're going to look at is the entity that maps to our SQL table, in this case a Postgres SQL table. And yes, I am using Java 17, so a lot can change. For example, I can use the record feature instead of having a lot of Lombok annotations here, but more on that another day. Okay, so we are now back at our test case and we're ready to test this repository now that we've seen what it looks like. One step before that is, or rather one more step, is that I've created this mocked planets util, and the idea behind it is that it's gonna generate all the planets that I need to save into the database. As you can see, it's just creating a list with the planets. And you'll remember with our planets, we've got a node and a name. Simple as that. So we're gonna fetch this list and persist it to our containerized test container. And then we're gonna use that in our test case. Okay, so to do that, let's start off by creating a new test case. And we'll call this should fetch all planets, right? And because now we're ready to test our repository, we now need to ask Spring to inject this because we want to use it. And we want to inject our planet repository in here. Great. So the first thing we want to do in our test case is to also make sure that we can save all of this. So let's call save all. And remember, we have our mock util that's going to generate all the data for us. So what we're going to do is call that. And we're going to fetch all our planets that we want to save. To make it easy, what we can do is just create a new list here, and then we save all. Now that we've saved all, we want to make sure that we can fetch. So the first part that should pass is this layer here at 42, because it would have saved to the database. And then the next thing we want to make sure of is that we can find all. And what we can do is say asset not null. Great. So now let's run this test case and see what happens. Okay, our test case is happy. I did spot a few errors. I'll look at those later. It's probably the test containers or the Spring framework bug somewhere, which we'll look at some other day. So there, our test case has passed. We can actually validate this with the debug just to see the actual planets that we have saved into the DB. And as you can see via the debug, while we have just stopped at that point, you can see all the planets coming from the database. Awesome. Let's let that run through, and we stop right there. So let's back up a bit and explain what happened. Okay, we're right back at the top. Before we explain, let me just correct the spelling here. It's actually supposed to be Postgres. Yes, it is renamed everywhere. Okay, cool. So the first question you may have is this annotation right there. So this annotation is used in JUnit 5, aka JUnit Jupyter. It is used in JUnit 5 tests to enable the automatic lifecycle management of test containers. This means when you annotate a test class with this annotation, test containers will automatically start and stop any containers defined within the test class or that class. This ensures proper setup and teardown of the containers for each test. So for those that have used test containers in the past, you will remember that you would have had to go and say Postgres start in your before each or before class. And similarly, when you're done, you would have had to do that to stop it. So this is no longer necessary. This annotation takes care of that for you. And now the second thing you're probably wondering, that is very much new, is the service connection. Now the service connection annotation is a feature provided by Spring Boot Test Containers integration. You'll remember the dependency that we brought in first. And the idea is that it is used to simplify the configuration and management of containerized services in a Spring Boot test, all right, such as databases or other dependencies that your application might require. So another thing in the past with Spring, and this is possibly still the case outside of Spring because this service connection is a Spring annotation. So think of properties like the JDBC URL, the username and password, the database name, and the database port. And even with Spring, we recently had to bring in these configurations programmatically into our test cases, but it's no longer the case now that we've got this add service connection annotation. And the last one we can talk about, which you probably ask yourself about, is this add container annotation. Now this annotation will actually drive the lifecycle of the Postgres container, and it will have all those details that you do not need to specify. Things like your username, your password, and so forth, the port number, etc. And that's mainly it on test containers. Another note is you can use test containers with other modules as shown in the beginning of the video. You can use test containers with brokers like Kafka, message brokers like Kafka, or in-memory DBs like Redis, and many more. So let me know if you want me to make a tutorial or a walkthrough on using message brokers like Kafka, or if you want me to do test containers outside of Spring. And we have come to our close. That's it for a quick tutorial on using test containers. If you found this video helpful, please like and subscribe. Feel free to leave any questions in the comments below. Thanks for watching.